I'm live. Wow. So this is another one of my random topic videos. I don't even know if I haven't even checked to see if the other video I did had any views. It probably didn't. So congratulations, you're the only viewer. Uh, anyway, I just was kind of inspired um, by watching a Progressive Rock Music Awards ceremony, and Tony Banks won that some category, and he was just doing a speech. He's won some award, and he's doing a speech, and it just made me think about how uh, an interesting topic is the how progressive rock happened. And it's a many faceted thing. There's no one thing. You could almost give credit to people like um, Bob Dylan, or the Beatles, or Phil Spector. And I guess you would say is the very early days of what later retrospectively progressive rock was looked upon at. It was pop music, and it was Pet Sounds was one of the first records that kind of broke the boundaries of what uh, it's not so much that it was really a new sound, it's just that uh, the Beach Boys were doing surf music, and then all of a sudden they're doing this music that is really sophisticated and very classically oriented and very kind of old folks music. The stuff that was 20th century music, which we look upon now retrospectively and say, "Hey, this is what we're doing." So I think I'm doing so far so good in this video, um, and that so there's I don't want to I don't want to misrepresent progressive rock, but there's a kind of a subgenre of progressive rock, which is the dominant genre of progressive rock. As when you mention the word progressive rock, usually you're talking about bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, possibly Focus. I think Focus, PFM, which is an Italian progressive rock band. You could go on a huge list of bands, but all those bands, most of them have one thing in common. That is, they either were really good jazz musicians, or classically trained musicians, or rock musicians that were interested in classical music. So it's sometimes called symphonic progressive rock. But that's kind of a ridiculous thing, because it's almost like it's so dominant at one time that there was no other form of progressive rock other than symphonic progressive rock. But then there's bands like Gentle Giant that kind of broke all the rules. They were just doing their own thing. It was sometimes it was jazzy, sometimes it was funky, sometimes it was medieval. It fit symphonic really well, but they didn't really stay on the page. So some of the bands, they didn't have any boundaries of as to what they're going to sound like, and so. But in general, you're talking about that, and uh, those kind of bands that really made progressive rock famous were mostly classically oriented musicians. And there's one exception, I guess, is that a lot of people associate progressive rock with Pink Floyd. Not one exception, but the biggest exception is that uh, Pink Floyd, uh, they had their own sound that wasn't uh, progressive rock. And if you it wasn't like the class symphonic progressive rock, and they weren't classically trained musicians, really. They were just R&B musicians, basically. And that's another whole story why an R&B band would be progressive rock, and that has to do with kind of the changes of the scene in London. Basically, was it went from blues, actually originally started as jazz back in the 50s. There's a Flamingo Club, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but there's like a place called the Flamingo Club and the Marquee Club, and they had jazz musicians and jazz bands, and traditional, I don't know what you call it traditional, but big bands, play there. So you had people like Frank Sinatra there and stuff like that, and then so people like people from America would show up, and there'd be like someone like Ray Charles or something, probably, I imagine, and so they started to break in, in London, and so it's not exactly related to the Liverpool thing, although it eventually became, I mean, retrospectively, we see what the Beatles did, and that's a huge thing that happened. So if I haven't confused you yet, I should continue to confuse you now. So try to eliminate some of the confusion. Is what I'm saying is that the bottom line is there were classically trained musicians that heard about rock and roll. They knew rock and roll was popular, and they started to like rock and roll, and so they're very qualified for the job. They knew how to read music, they could play classical pieces, and Keith Emerson was a tremendous virtuoso uh, piano player, mainly when he first started off, and then he got into rock and roll, and at that time that Keith Emerson got into the scene, it was the R&B uh, was taking off. The original Beatles thing happened, and so there's a lot of bands that sound like the Beatles, and then there's the blues thing happened, and then right around the same time the blues thing started happening, the early days of R&B in England started happening. It was, and a lot of people call it mod, but mod is a clothing style. But there was a different kind of R&B than what was going on in America most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time the R&B was guitar oriented and had a keyboard player, and so you have this organ player or a piano player in an R&B band, and so Keith Emerson's definitely no exception to that rule. His first big band that he was in, other than the very first band he was well, his first band he was in that was a R&B group. They had horn section and everything, and so he did that, and then he became part of the backing band for P.P. Arnold, which was an R&B singer that came from Tina Turner, Ike and Tina Turner's band, the Turnettes or something. I forgot what they're called, but something like that. Ikettes, yeah, the Ikettes, and so P.P. Arnold came from that. And that was a backing band, and obviously Keith Emerson would get up there and start playing stuff, and P.P. Arnold was obviously impressed and said, this is ridiculous that you're sitting there playing R&B when it's really kind of below your pay grade. And so she kind of encouraged Keith Emerson to start playing his classical music, because he heard him put these licks in right in the middle of a rock beat. He would just start throwing in a little bit of Bach concerto or something right in the middle of an R&B tune. It'd be a certain chord sequence or whatever, because all those things follow the same rules. And so you have a pop song that's, C, A minor, F, and G. Well, there's stuff in classical that does that. So he would just find something that would fit in that and play that nice piece of classical music. And so, and he's noodling around playing classical. So she, kind of filling in the gaps, but that she discovered Keith Emerson, and his backing band went along with that and started playing classical music. And so is in the strictest form of a fusion between R&B and classical music was the early days of the Nice. And then the psychedelic thing happened, and that was about the same time kind of the Nice was forming, and when they split off of P.P.R. Arnold, so the Nice became a psychedelic band that had these classical influences in it, and they would play classical pieces of music, and it was very simple. It was just simply take classical music, take psychedelic music, which is based on R&B and rock, but has all these other interesting influences, jazz, psychedelic, Indian music, strange effects boxes, all this interesting stuff that they're experimenting with, experimental form of music. And so that opened the doors for experimentation, which led to people to be open to accepting anything. They were waiting to see something different. And so when Hendrix came about, that's when Keith Emerson started up his game and said, hey, wait a second, I've got to do something. And so he started to get his organ and pick it up and tilt it and wrestle with it. And basically, what happened, pretty much in a nutshell, was he picked the organ up to move it, uh, just to get across the stage, and as part of the kind of the stage show, he just kind of moved the thing, and he dropped the thing, and it made this huge crashing noise, and everybody just applauded it. They thought it was fantastic. So he got known. Everybody started going, "You should hear this guy, the Nice Keith Emerson with the Nice." They have this guy on the keyboard that's like Jimi Hendrix on keyboards, and he makes it squeal and tilts it around and gets on top of the organ and all this stuff. So he became the Jimi Hendrix of keyboards. So there's a foundation that was laid of Jimi Hendrix. Um, and certainly Jimi Hendrix is progressive rock because psychedelic is progressive in nature, and then it just became a strong dominant thing, and then all of a sudden later on in the next few years that followed, Keith Emerson, he got into uh, putting entire pieces of classical music on a record, and so he had what was called the epic these days. But in retrospect, it was just a classical piece of music with different movements, and that was very groundbreaking. There was not very many bands, if any, that was doing that, uh, except for perhaps just some exploration by various groups. Uh, the Beatles opened doors for groups to kind of experiment with different things. So everything had happened under the sun by 1968, 69, but it was emphasized more by Keith Emerson as far as the classical music goes. And so what makes this all interesting is that just you're talking about a period of time where we went from rock and roll in 1953 being basically boogie woogie music. The earliest rock and roll was boogie woogie, and then rockabilly came out in the next year or so, I suppose. And that was Elvis. It was kind of like rockabilly, and then you had rockabilly, and then you had the early boogie woogie type rock and roll. Which, speaking of, Ike Turner was on one of the early rock and roll songs. Like the first single actually was called something. Well, anyway, we're not talking about early rock and roll. We're talking about progressive rock. So it started off with real primitive, just um, you know, boogie woogie music is not super primitive, but it's it's copies of 1 4 5 chord progression. So that's like three chords, and then you just put some verses in there, and you got a song and a chorus. And so it went from that to when the Beatles came out, they started to their producer, George Martin, was a classical musician, and so he could arrange string arrangements and things like that. And the Beatles started to think outside the box, and so George Martin was doing some experimental thing. This is kind of after the initial success of the Beatles, but it did happen right away. As soon as the Beatles got successful, they started to experiment with different things. And then you had Yesterday, which is fairly early in their career, and you had Yesterday, and you had things like "And I Love Her," which had claves on it, and it says that even on the album cover they put new things into the mix and make it interesting. And so that was significant, but it has almost nothing to do with, because you're just basically talking about R&B, which happened uh, in England, which was a big deal in England. I think Ray Charles is pretty much the one that started it. People like Ray Charles, and they're doing that. So you had Stevie Winwood, and you had bunch of bands that were doing that early on that liked this more sophisticated thing that was going on, jazz and Ray Charles and things like that. And the Rolling Stones were into that, and a lot of the blues musicians were into that. So it was all friendly. So R&B thing took off, and the Who was part of that, and the mod scene, was part of that, and the Small Faces. And in fact, the Small Faces, you want to talk about the Small Faces, it's like the Nice was on the Small Faces record label, which was a terrible record label, but that's another side story. But P.P. Arnold was the girlfriend of Steve Marriott, the Small Faces singer, but that's a kind of trivial. Uh, so I hope you find this little chat interesting. I don't know what purpose it serves to you personally, uh, but I'm just kind of laying some of the foundation for what I'm into. Um, and these are supposed to be impromptu things. They're not rehearsed. They're not scripted. Um, and it's a wide topic, and I don't expect a high viewership right now. Maybe in the future, I can look back at these and crack up because I didn't take it seriously enough, and I just turned on the camera, and that was it. But I've done this. Don't get me wrong, though. It's not like I'm really new to doing videos. I've done it a lot. I've done videos a lot, but this is just a kind of I'm redoing it. I'm starting it over again.